It was a night of blinding snow and silence when a small 5-year-old girl dragged a wooden cart through the storm. On that cart lay a wounded German Shepherd K9, his body bloodied and still, every breath faint. Her tiny frame shivered, her lips blue from the cold, yet her eyes fixed on the faint glow of a cabin door ahead. She stopped, tears freezing on her cheeks, and looked up in desperate hope. At that door stood Clara Johnson, a 60-year-old woman who had long carried the weight of prejudice from her town. What would happen when two lives, one broken by the world and one judged by it, finally crossed paths on this stormy night? Before we begin, take a moment to imagine this scene. If you had opened the door and seen a child with a wounded dog begging for help, what would you have done? Share your thoughts in the comments, and may your day be filled with kindness, hope, and compassion. The night had already sunk deep into silence when the storm began to gather its strength. Snow fell in endless sheets, blurring the outlines of the small Colorado town, turning familiar houses into vague shapes behind veils of white. The streets, once busy during the day, now lay deserted, every door locked tight, every window shut against the howling wind. No footsteps echoed, no carriage rolled by, and even the strayed dogs had hidden from the cold. It was the kind of night when the world seemed to fold in on itself, and silence took on the weight of something ominous. Down one of the narrower streets, where dim street lamps flickered behind curtains of snow, a woman trudged wearily home from her late shift at the local tavern. Her name was Margaret, the mother of Emily, and though still in her 30s, her face already carried the exhaustion of someone who had lived two lives in one. Her figure was slight, wrapped in a faded wool coat patched at the elbows, her dark hair tied back carelessly, and her shoes, worn thin from years of use, crunched weakly in the snow. She carried no more than a small cloth bag, inside a few coins and scraps of bread saved for her daughter. Behind her trotted Emily, only 5 years old, clutching a wooden doll missing an arm. They were not alone for long. From the shadowed corner near an abandoned store, 3 boys stepped into their path. They were not men, yet not children either, all around 16 or 17, faces raw from the cold but twisted with arrogance. The tallest wore a red hoodie, his lanky arms swinging loosely as if ready for mischief. The second, shorter with a baseball cap pulled low, chewed a toothpick with forced bravado. The third, heavy-set with round cheeks flushed from both cold and drink, smirked like trouble was a pastime. Their eyes gleamed with the cruel excitement of youth unchecked, and the night became their theater. "Well, look at this," the one in the red hoodie sneered, his breath fogging in the frigid air. "A lady walking home from the tavern." "Did you bring us anything?" His tone was mocking, not playful. The shorter boy laughed, circling closer, while the heavy-set one dragged his boot across the snow, as if drawing an invisible line she should not cross. Margaret instinctively pushed Emily behind her, her hand trembling but firm, eyes locked on the boys with a mixture of fear and defiance. "Leave us alone," she said, voice low but steady. The storm swallowed her words, yet the challenge in her tone cut through. The laughter sharpened. The boy in the hoodie leaned in, poking her shoulder. "Or what? You gonna fight us off?" The others joined, jeering, their voices shrill against the blizzard. Margaret's heart raced. She knew these boys. The whole town knew them. Restless youths with no guidance, hungry for dominance in a place too small to contain their wildness. Emily peeked out from behind her mother, wide blue eyes filled with confusion. Her blonde hair, tied into 2 messy pigtails, was damp with snowflakes, her pink dress already soaked through. She clutched her doll to her chest, lips trembling. Margaret tried to step back, but the heavy-set boy blocked the way, his broad figure looming. Fear crept into her chest, but she did not move aside. She had endured too much in life to bow now, not while her child was at risk. The first shove was sudden, a hard push to her shoulder that sent her staggering sideways. Emily cried out, clinging to her mother's coat. The second blow came sharper, a fist to the ribs. Margaret gasped, pain searing through her side, but she didn't fall. "Stop it!" she screamed, but her voice was drowned by their cruel laughter. Snow swirled around them like a cruel audience, indifferent to the violence it concealed. The boys grew bolder, their movements faster, their strikes heavier. At last, one shove too many sent Margaret sprawling backward into the snow. Her head struck the frozen ground, the breath knocked out of her chest. A red bloom spread beneath her, stark against the white, the cold rushing to claim her body. She tried to rise, but her limbs betrayed her. In the final surge of will, she turned her face toward Emily and gasped with all her fading strength, "Run! Find someone! Don't come back!" Her words, broken but fierce, lodged into the child's heart like a command carved into stone. Before the boys could react further, a shape burst from the darkness with a guttural snarl. Ranger, the family's 6-year-old German shepherd, lunged forward, his powerful frame black-backed with tan chest and legs slammed against the red-hoodied boy, sending him sprawling. His amber eyes blazed, ears pinned, muscles straining with fury. Once, long ago, Ranger had served as a K-9 alongside a fallen police officer, and the discipline of those years flashed through him now. He snapped his jaws at the heavy-set boy's arm, forcing him back with a cry of shock. For a moment, the night seemed to tilt in Margaret's favor. But 3 against 1 is cruel odds, even for a warrior. A jagged piece of ice, hurled with force, struck Ranger in the flank. He yelped but did not retreat. Another kick to his leg sent him staggering. The boys, emboldened, swarmed him with stones and fists. Emily shrieked as Ranger fought valiantly, biting, clawing, until at last a blow to his hind leg made him stumble. Blood streaked the snow beneath his paws, his chest heaving with effort. And then, with a pitiful whine, he collapsed beside Margaret's unmoving form. Emily stood frozen in horror, tears streaming down her pale cheeks. She looked at her mother, still and silent, then at Ranger, bloodied and broken, and something inside her shattered. Her little hands fumbled with the rope of a small wooden cart that had been left outside their home. With desperate strength far beyond her years, she dragged it across the snow, lifted Ranger's limp body onto it, and began to pull. The cart's wheels groaned, catching in the drifts, but she did not stop. Her sobs mixed with the wind, her tiny feet slipping, sandals useless in the snow. The boys, startled by her sudden flight, shouted but didn't chase. Perhaps the sight of her tears pierced even their cruel bravado, or perhaps the storm was punishment enough. They faded into the shadows, leaving Emily alone with the howling wind. She dragged step by step, her doll still clutched in one arm, her other straining at the rope. Behind her, the cart creaked under Ranger's weight, his head lolling, his breath shallow but still there. The street stretched endlessly, every house sealed tight, every light extinguished. Emily's vision blurred from tears and exhaustion. But then, ahead, she saw it. A faint glow, flickering from the window of a small wooden cabin at the end of the lane, the only light in a world swallowed by storm. Her lips quivered, her face streaked with blood and snow, but her steps grew faster, dragging the cart with all the strength left in her. At last, she reached the doorstep, her small figure nearly collapsing from fatigue. She looked up at the door, trembling, eyes wide with desperate hope. Her breath came in ragged gasps, and with the last of her strength, she lifted a tiny fist and knocked. Behind that door lived Clara Johnson, 60 years old, hair short and gray, a woman scarred by the weight of society's prejudice, unaware that on this night her life was about to intertwine with a child's desperate plea for salvation. The storm outside still roared with the fury of a wild animal when the tiny fists struck against the wooden door. Snow clung to Emily's hair and lashes, melting into tears that streaked down her pale face. Her knuckles, raw and purple from the cold, tapped again. Weaker this time, as if she feared the silence behind the door would swallow her whole. The wooden cart creaked as it shifted behind her, carrying the limp body of Ranger, his once proud chest now rising and falling in shallow breaths. Inside the cabin, the faint glow of firelight cast flickering shadows against the walls, and behind the door stood Clara Johnson, a 60-year-old woman whose world had long been carved by silence and solitude. Clara hesitated at the first knock. She was used to quiet evenings where the only company was the crackle of her hearth and the wind rattling through the pine trees outside. Wrapped in a heavy wool cardigan, her gray curls tucked under a scarf, she had been sewing a patch onto an old blanket when the sound broke through the night. Her life had been a long line of such nights, quiet and unremarkable, but also heavy with the invisible weight of stares and whispers from a town that never fully accepted her. Her brown skin, her age, her independence had made her an outsider, and so she had learned to expect little from the world. But when the knocks came again, frantic and uneven, something in her chest stirred. With cautious steps, Clara approached the door, the old floorboards groaning under her weight. She pulled the latch, and the door swung open, letting in a rush of snow and cold. What she saw made her breath catch in her throat. There, under the storm's fury, stood a child no older than 5, drenched, trembling, her golden pigtails plastered to her cheeks, her small pink dress clinging to her body like wet paper. Her wide blue eyes were rimmed with terror, her lips a frightening shade of blue, and her frail arms tugged at the handle of the cart behind her. On the cart, a German shepherd lay motionless, its dark fur streaked with blood, its body shaking with labored breath. Clara froze, staring at the tableau, disbelief and recognition colliding inside her. Emily's voice broke the silence, a hoarse whisper barely audible over the storm. "Help us, please." The plea was raw, stripped of everything except desperation. Clara's heart clenched. She had seen many things in her 60 years, moments when cruelty outweighed kindness, when innocence was crushed beneath indifference. Yet never had such need appeared so suddenly at her own door. Without another thought, she bent down, her arms surprisingly strong despite her age, and scooped the child into her embrace. With her other hand, she tugged the cart over the threshold, dragging both the girl and the wounded dog into the warmth of her home. Inside, the air was warmer, though the fire struggled against the draft seeping through the old logs. Clara lowered Emily onto a chair near the hearth, draping a woolen blanket over her shivering body. The child clung to it like a lifeline, sobs shaking her chest. Clara turned her attention to the dog, her eyes narrowing as she assessed the injuries. The animal was large, easily 80 pounds, but his body felt frighteningly light as she lifted him onto a rug near the fire. His fur was soaked, the black of his back dulled to gray by dirt and blood, his tan chest marred with open wounds. One hind leg hung at an unnatural angle, hastily bound with a strip of cloth. Clara's hands trembled as she reached for her old medical kit, tucked away in a cabinet she hadn't opened in years. Memories surged back, unbidden. Tents filled with wounded soldiers, the metallic tang of blood mingling with the acrid scent of smoke, the steady rhythm of her own voice as she tried to reassure young men clinging to their last breaths. She had been a field nurse once, decades ago, and though time had passed, her fingers still remembered the motions. Kneeling beside Ranger, she cut away the matted fur, cleaned the gashes with steady precision, and stitched the largest wound closed. Her body shook with the strain, but she pushed on, whispering soft words as though the animal could hear and understand. Emily's sobs grew louder, piercing the stillness. Clara paused, wiping her brow, and turned to the girl. The child's small hands gripped the blanket, knuckles white, eyes swimming with grief. "They hurt my mom," Emily cried, her words fractured by hiccups. They hit her. She told me to run." Clara's chest tightened. She crossed the room, kneeling to gather the child into her arms. The girl buried her face into Clara's shoulder, her tears soaking the fabric of the woman's old coat. Clara rocked her gently, murmuring soothing words, though inside her own heart burned with familiar rage. She had known what it was to watch helplessly as those you love are struck down, to feel powerless against the cruelty of others. As the firelight danced across the room, Clara returned to the dog, carefully loosening the black harness still strapped around his body. The leather was worn, frayed in places, but it was the mark beneath that caught her eye. A deep groove, a scar worn into the fur and flesh of his neck, unmistakable to anyone who had seen it before. This was no stray. This was the mark of a service animal, a K9 trained for police or military work. Clara touched the scar gently, her breath catching. She remembered soldiers and their dogs, partners in battle, animals who had shown more loyalty than many men. She leaned back, studying the animal more closely. Despite the blood and exhaustion clouding his amber eyes, there was discipline in the way his body lay, even in defeat. His ears twitched faintly at her touch, not in fear, but in recognition of calm authority. Clara's gaze flicked to Emily, whose watery eyes met hers with a silent plea. In the child's grief, Clara saw the reflection of her own youth, the memory of watching her mother beaten in broad daylight, powerless to stop it, scarred forever by the knowledge that society looked away because of the color of their skin. She knew that look of despair, that helplessness, and it cut through her like a blade. Time seemed to stand still in that small cabin, the storm outside beating against the walls as if trying to enter. Inside, 3 lives, an old woman hardened by prejudice, a child broken by sudden tragedy, and a dog scarred by a past of service and loss were drawn together by chance. Clara tended to the wounds, her hands moving with quiet determination, while Emily clung to her side, seeking warmth and comfort. Ranger, though battered and weak, let out a soft sigh, his head resting against the rug, as if surrendering to the safety of the moment. Clara looked from the child to the dog, and for the first time in many years, she felt something stir within her chest. It was more than pity, more than anger at the cruelty of others. It was recognition, the kind that binds strangers into family. She tightened the blanket around Emily, stroked the child's tangled hair, and whispered softly, "You're safe now." Outside, the storm howled on, but within the cabin, a fragile circle of warmth had begun to form, fragile but unbreakable. The cabin was quiet except for the storm clawing at the walls and the uneven crackle of the fire. Emily sat close to the hearth, her small body wrapped tightly in a blanket, but her trembling would not cease. Clara had just finished bandaging Ranger again, her hands moving with practiced care, when the girl's voice broke through the stillness, choked and trembling. With tears spilling down her face, Emily whispered the words that tightened Clara's chest like a vice. "My mom. She's still out there. She told me to run, but she didn't get up." The child's voice cracked, and her sobs filled the room, her tiny fists clutching at the worn wool around her shoulders. Clara froze. The image of a woman lying unconscious in the snow, battered and bleeding, filled her mind with terrible clarity. She knew too well what the cold could do to the human body, how quickly blood loss and exposure could steal life away. Every minute, every second mattered. Her storm-gray eyes, hardened by years of solitude and prejudice, softened with urgency as she rose to her feet. She crossed the room to the old wooden table where a dusty black rotary phone sat, its cord curled like an ancient snake. Her hands shook as she reached for it, the weight of decision heavy on her shoulders. Lifting the receiver, Clara dialed a number she had not used in years, each turn of the dial echoing through the silence like a drumbeat of fate. On the other end of that line was Michael Harris, the town's sheriff, a man in his late 60s with a frame still broad from years of service. His hair, once jet black, was now silver-cropped close to his head, his face weathered by duty, but his voice still carried the authority of a soldier who had commanded men. He and Clara had shared the chaos of battle once, decades earlier, when she was a nurse and he a young officer, both learning to keep others alive under impossible circumstances. When Michael's voice came through the crackling line, deep and steady, Clara did not waste a breath. "Michael, it's Clara," she said, her voice trembling but urgent. "There is a woman out there, badly hurt. Attacked. She's lying in the snow and won't survive without help." She paused, her throat tight as she added, "Please, I need you." For a moment, silence answered her, the kind of silence that made the storm outside sound louder. Then his reply came, without hesitation, carrying weight not only of duty but of memory. "Where is she?" he asked firmly. Clara gave him directions, her words stumbling yet precise. Michael Harris was not a man easily swayed by rumor or panic, but Clara's voice cut through the years and spoke to a part of him that still remembered debts owed. He had once staggered, wounded and near death, through a battlefield hospital where Clara's steady hands had stitched his side and her stern voice had kept him awake. That night long ago had stayed with him, a reminder that his life had been spared because of her. Now, as sheriff of the very town that had never welcomed her, he felt the debt rise again like an unspoken command. "I'll be there," he said, his tone clipped, decisive. Within minutes, the sheriff had gathered 2 deputies from the small outpost near the town square. The younger, Deputy Carl Whitman, barely in his 20s, fumbled with his heavy coat and rifle, his eagerness mixing with nerves. The other, Deputy Louise Carter, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a calm, no-nonsense demeanor, tightened her scarf and pulled her hat low against the snow. Together, they climbed into the department's battered 4-wheel truck, its headlights slicing weak beams through the curtain of white. Michael drove with grim determination, his gloved hands gripping the wheel as the storm battered their windshield. "She wouldn't call me if it wasn't real," he muttered, more to himself than to the others. Back at the cabin, Clara replaced the receiver, her body sagging slightly as though the call had drained her. Emily looked up at her with wide, wet eyes, searching for reassurance. Clara knelt beside her, smoothing the child's damp hair from her forehead. "They're coming," she whispered, though inside she could not silence the voice reminding her how cruel winter could be, how quickly life could vanish when left on the frozen ground. Ranger let out a faint whine from the rug, his body shifting as though sensing the tension in the room. Clara placed a hand gently on his side, grounding herself in the warmth still pulsing beneath his fur. The minutes that followed were endless. Emily sat on Clara's lap, trembling as though her body had forgotten how to stop. Clara hummed softly, a tune her mother used to sing when storms rattled their house long ago, though her own throat was thick with unshed grief. Her eyes drifted often to the window where the storm pressed its white face against the glass, each gust of wind sounding like a taunt. She imagined the woman Emily's mother lying somewhere in that frozen hell, her life balanced on a knife's edge, and her heart pounded against the waiting. At last, the phone rang again, its shrill cry slicing through the stillness. Clara nearly stumbled as she rushed to it, Emily clutching at her sleeve with fearful eyes. She lifted the receiver, her breath shallow, her voice cracking as she said, "Michael?" On the other end came the answer she had prayed for. "We found her," Michael's voice said, firm but edged with fatigue. "She's alive, Clara, but in bad shape." "We're taking her to the hospital now." Clara closed her eyes, relief flooding her body like warmth after frostbite. Her knees nearly gave way as she whispered, "Thank God!" Emily's small voice rose beside her, desperate and trembling. Is my mom?" Clara lowered the phone slowly, then crouched to meet the child's gaze. "They found her," she said softly, her hands cupping Emily's cold cheeks. "She's alive, sweetheart. They're taking her to the hospital." The words barely left her mouth before Emily collapsed into her arms, sobbing with a mix of grief, relief, and exhaustion. She clung to Clara as though the older woman were the last anchor in a world that had broken apart. Clara held her close, her heart aching as the child's tears dampened her shoulder. The fire crackled softly, Ranger stirred faintly on the rug, and the storm continued to howl outside. But inside the cabin, a fragile calm began to settle. Clara stroked Emily's hair, her eyes glistening as she gazed into the fire. She knew the night was not yet over, that danger still lingered in the echoes of violence that had led the girl to her door. But for now, for this single breath of time, Emily had hope. Her mother had a chance, and Clara allowed herself to exhale, the weight on her chest easing ever so slightly. Morning came slowly, the storm clouds thinning into a gray sky streaked with pale light. The snow lay thick across the town of Bearcliff, blanketing rooftops and fences, muffling the sounds of wagons and footsteps. In Clara's small cabin, the fire had burned low, but the air held a fragile warmth. Emily clung to Clara's side, her cheeks still blotched from tears, but her eyes calmer now that hope for her mother's survival had been restored. Ranger dozed weakly near the hearth, a faint rise and fall of his chest marking each precious breath. Clara wrapped a scarf tightly around her neck, lifted her coat from its hook, and prepared to step into the cold. She needed medicine for the dog, and she would not let fear keep her from doing what was necessary. With Emily bundled in a too large woolen coat, the two figures walked carefully along the icy path toward the center of town. The streets, though quieter after the storm, had begun to stir with morning routines. Shopkeepers shoveled their doorsteps, women carried baskets to the market, and the tavern owner was already sweeping the stoop. Clara's presence drew stares, as it always had. A 60-year-old black woman with short gray curls tucked under a scarf, her back straight though her body carried the weight of decades of prejudice, she had grown used to the whispers that followed her. But today the looks felt sharper, more pointed, and Emily squeezed her hand tighter, sensing the shift. At the marketplace, the change became clear. Two men leaned against a wagon, their breath rising in frosty puffs as they spoke in low tones. "They say she took the girl," one muttered, his eyes cutting toward Clara. "Brought her into that cabin, won't let anyone else near." A woman selling eggs added with a hiss, "I heard it from my cousin. Said he saw her last night, pulling that child inside. No mother anywhere. What else could it be but kidnapping?" Their words slithered through the air, catching like sparks on dry wood. Emily pressed against Clara's side, her blue eyes wide, her small body trembling. The rumors had not sprouted from nowhere. In the tavern, three boys huddled over mugs of watered-down cider, their faces pale with guilt hidden beneath bravado. They were the same who had attacked Margaret, Emily's mother, and nearly killed Ranger. But to protect themselves, they whispered lies into eager ears, claiming that Clara had been the one who lured Emily away, that the dog was hers, that the scene on the snowy street had been a trick. Their words spread quickly, carried by gossips eager for drama and fueled by the town's long-held suspicion of Clara. By the time the morning was half gone, the seed of slander had taken root. When Clara and Emily returned from the apothecary with a small bundle of herbs and tinctures, they found several villagers waiting near her cabin. Men and women stood stiffly in the snow, their faces set with suspicion. One, a stout farmer with a thick beard and patched coat, spoke first. "We heard you've got a child in there that doesn't belong to you," he said gruffly. "You'd best explain yourself." His tone carried not curiosity but accusation, and murmurs of agreement rippled through the group. Emily gasped and clung to Clara's arm, her tiny fingers digging into the fabric. Another woman, tall and thin with a bonnet pulled tight around her face, stepped forward. "You've always kept to yourself, Clara, always been different. And now we find a white girl under your roof while her mother is nowhere to be seen. People are saying things, and it doesn't look right." Her voice shook with a mix of fear and eagerness, the kind of tone that belongs to someone who has already chosen to believe the worst. Clara's jaw tightened, her storm-gray eyes flicking across the crowd. For a moment she felt the old familiar burn of injustice, the same fire that had haunted her since she was a girl watching her own mother be struck in public while neighbors turned away. Emily buried her face against Clara's side, whimpering. The sight hardened Clara's resolve. Slowly she stepped forward, her figure framed by the doorway of the cabin, the morning light catching the lines of her face. She stood tall despite the weight of years, her coat flapping in the wind, her voice ringing out clear and strong. "Last night," she declared, "a child and a faithful dog came to me in the storm, bloodied, broken, begging for shelter. I chose to save them. I chose life over silence. And now you come here with whispers and venom, choosing to spread lies instead of gratitude." Her words hung in the air like steel. For a moment, the crowd faltered, eyes shifting uncomfortably, lips pursing. The stout farmer lowered his gaze, though he did not step back. The tall woman's mouth tightened, her bonnet trembling slightly as she held her chin high. Clara's voice did not waver. "You think I would harm a child? You think I would drag a dog bleeding through the snow for show? Shame on you. The truth is out there in the storm with her mother, fighting for her life in a hospital bed. And here you stand, condemning me while the real guilty hide behind your ignorance." Emily clung tighter, her small shoulders shaking, but when she looked up, she saw Clara unflinching, her eyes fierce, her presence unbowed. The child's own fear began to ease, replaced by something like awe. Ranger stirred faintly inside, his ears twitching as though he sensed the rise in tension. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the wind curling around the eaves and the distant caw of a raven. Then the murmurs softened, the accusations dulled. Some in the crowd shuffled their feet, others turned their eyes away. Clara's defiance had struck something deeper than their prejudice, though the air remained thick with unease. The confrontation did not end with cheers or apologies, but the silence that followed was enough to halt the momentum of the mob. The people lingered, uncertain, their breath hanging in the cold air as they struggled between rumor and reason. Clara stood tall, her arm wrapped protectively around Emily, daring them to push further. None did. They backed away slowly, leaving only the crunch of their boots in the snow. The tension lingered, heavy and unresolved, but for the moment, Clara had won a fragile reprieve. Inside once more, Clara shut the door firmly, her breath trembling in her chest. She leaned against the wood for a moment, her eyes closing, then looked down at Emily, who clutched her hand with unspoken gratitude. Clara smoothed the child's hair and whispered softly, "They don't know the truth yet, but we do. And we will hold on until it cannot be denied." The fire flickered, Ranger exhaled heavily, and the cabin seemed once again a fragile island of warmth, in a world where rumors cut sharper than the storm. The tension outside Clara's cabin had not yet lifted. The villagers stood in clusters, their voices lowered but sharp, suspicion still heavy in the air. Emily clung to Clara's side, her face pale, her small hands trembling as if she feared at any moment someone might tear her away. Clara remained steady, her storm-gray eyes fixed on the restless crowd, her posture upright, her voice still echoing from the words she had spoken. But inside she knew the weight of their prejudice was like ice. It lingered, refusing to thaw. Then, through the crunch of boots on snow, another sound pierced the murmurs, the measured stride of authority. Michael Harris appeared at the edge of the gathering, his heavy coat dusted with snow, his sheriff's badge gleaming faintly under the weak winter sun. In his 60s, his frame still broad, his presence carried the authority of a man who had commanded others in war and in peace. His silver hair glinted beneath his hat, his lined face set with resolve. Two deputies followed close behind, Carl Whitman, young and uncertain, and Louise Carter, sharp-eyed and calm. Their hands rested on the grips of their holstered weapons, not in threat but in readiness, a reminder that the law had arrived. The crowd shifted uneasily, whispers faltering. Michael raised a gloved hand, his voice cutting through the cold with clarity. "Enough," he said. "I've heard the rumors, and I've heard the accusations. But the truth is not found in gossip." His eyes swept over the faces before him, then settled on Clara. For a heartbeat, his gaze softened, a flicker of respect and old loyalty passing between them. Then he turned back to the crowd, his tone hardening. "We have evidence. We know who hurt Margaret Thompson, Emily's mother, and it was not Clara Johnson." The words struck like a hammer blow. From behind the sheriff, two more officers pushed forward, dragging with them three boys, their faces pale against the cold. The tallest in a red hoodie, lanky and sneering no longer, stared at the ground as if it might swallow him. The shorter one with the cap trembled, trying to look defiant but failing. The heavy-set one whimpered softly, his cheeks raw, his bravado stripped away. Murmurs surged through the crowd as recognition spread. These were the same boys who loitered at the tavern, who picked fights in alleyways, who laughed too loudly at the expense of others. Michael's voice rose again. "They attacked Margaret in the storm. They left her bleeding in the snow, and when Clara took in this child, they spread lies to cover their crime." Gasps rippled through the assembly. The tall woman in the bonnet stepped back, her lips parting as if to protest, then closed tightly. The stout farmer frowned, shame flashing across his rugged face. The truth, once named, left little room for doubt. Louise Carter read out the charges, her voice crisp, her eyes darting to the crowd to make sure every word was heard. Assault, attempted murder, and obstruction. The boys squirmed, their protest drowned by the low rumble of voices shifting from suspicion to outrage. No longer aimed at Clara, the anger now turned toward those who had dared to poison the town with both fists and lies. Emily's grip on Clara's hand tightened, and she looked up at the older woman, eyes wide with something new relief. Clara bent her head slightly, her lips curving into the faintest smile, though her heart still beat heavily. Michael gave a short nod to his deputies, and the boys were marched away, their footsteps crunching in rhythm, their heads bowed in shame. For the first time in many years, Clara felt the weight of prejudice tilt, even if just slightly, under the force of truth. She had stood accused before, but never vindicated so publicly. Later that afternoon, a message arrived from the hospital, delivered by a nurse with wind-reddened cheeks and kind eyes. Margaret Thompson, though gravely injured, had survived surgery and was stable enough to send a few words. Written in a shaky hand on a piece of hospital stationery, the note carried more weight than any speech. "If not for Clara Johnson, my daughter and I would not be alive. She saved us when no one else would." The nurse's voice caught slightly as she read it aloud, and the crowd that had gathered again at Clara's doorstep stood silent, their faces flushed not with cold but with shame. The rumors, once sharp as blades, dissolved under the weight of testimony. Whispers were replaced by thoughtful silence, and gazes that once carried suspicion now lingered with something softer, something like respect. A few villagers even offered nods, tentative but genuine, as if acknowledging what they had long refused to see. Clara stood quietly, Emily at her side, Ranger resting nearby, his amber eyes half-lidded but alert. For the first time in years, Clara did not feel entirely alone in her own town. Ranger's recovery was slow but steady. Though his wounds healed under Clara's careful tending, the limp in his hind leg never fully left him. Each step carried the mark of his battle, a reminder of both pain and perseverance. Yet his spirit remained unbroken. He followed Emily faithfully, guarded the cabin door with quiet dignity, and accepted pats from those who dared approach. To the townspeople, he became a symbol of loyalty, of survival, of courage against cruelty. Children whispered his name with reverence. Adults nodded when he limped by, as if the scars he bore were shared by all. Margaret eventually returned home, her body marked by injuries that would take months, perhaps years, to fully recover. She moved slowly, her steps cautious, her strength easily spent. But her gratitude to Clara was boundless, her words to anyone who asked always the same: "She saved my family." Emily, however, had already found her heart tied to the woman who had held her through the storm, who had stood firm against the crowd, who had spoken truth when others would not. The child slipped her hand easily into Clara's now, her laughter returning in small bursts, her trust blooming again where it had nearly been extinguished. Clara Johnson, once the outcast, now stood in a new light. She had not sought recognition nor forgiveness from those who had wronged her, but in saving one child and one mother, she had revealed the hypocrisy of the town and broken the chains of rumor. Her home, once avoided, became a place whispered about with respect, a symbol of compassion's quiet strength. And though she remained the same woman she had always been, solitary, scarred, yet unyielding, she now carried with her the knowledge that sometimes truth, when fought for with love and sacrifice, could shift even the coldest hearts. The lesson lingered long after the storm. On evenings when the townsfolk gathered at the tavern, voices would lower when someone spoke her name, not with disdain, but with reverence. Children pointed at Ranger's silhouette against the snow and smiled, and Clara herself, watching Emily play by the firelight, understood the truth she had always believed but seldom seen proven. Prejudice may divide, but kindness and silent sacrifice hold the power to heal an entire community. In the end, this story is not only about a child, a wounded dog, or a woman once rejected by her town. It is about the quiet strength of those who rise above prejudice, the power of compassion that asks for nothing in return, and the silent sacrifices that change the world more deeply than anger ever could. Clara's courage reminds us that true healing begins when someone dares to care, even when it costs them everything. What do you think about this story? Share your thoughts in the comments and tell us how kindness has touched your own life. If the message speaks to you, subscribe to the channel so you never miss stories that inspire hope and humanity. And may God bless you and protect every silent hero in your life.